I wanted to first, of course, start by thanking our sponsors. We couldn't possibly be here and have these events without them. Our sponsors of Talking Green include Creekside Cafe and Grill, Homelink Magazine, Steamboat Magazine, and Mountain Resort. So thanks to our sponsors. I also wanted, before we get started with Mark, I want to give you a quick update on some upcoming events that we have. So if you're wondering why we're at the Depot tonight, it's because we're really excited. We partnered with the Arts Council on a show inspired by retreat. So if you get a minute after the presentation, go ahead and walk around the gallery if you haven't already. There's some amazing art in there, all inspired by trees and from artists all over the United States. So,
what's retreat?
Oh, retreat. Thank you, Maggie. If you're familiar with retreat is one of the Sustainability Council's programs where we plant about 1,000 trees per year in Routt County's open spaces, schools and open spaces. And it's really about diversifying our forests, but also connecting our community to forests. So it's a great event. We're actually finished with our planting events this year. We actually had 6 different planting events this year. We're finished with those, but we still have this show that's going to be here for another month. And associated with those, we have 2 workshops. On November 3rd, we have a tree pendant jewelry workshop with Jenny. I don't know if you guys know Jenny from the Milner Mall. But she's going to be working on jewelry making with stripped copper wire and stones found around steamboats, so repurposed copper wire. That's November 3rd. And then on November 19th, we have a retreat animal collage workshop with Carrie Searle. And it's a kids workshop working with its mixed media on using recycled paper. So go online to the Arts Council's website for more information and to register for those events. We also have coming up on November 17th from 5:30 to 7 at Moose Factory, our November Talking Green event. What's new with solar? So we have a great panel to talk about new solar technology and upcoming changes in the solar tax credit. So that's November 17th at Moose Factory. Again, for more information, you can go on our website to find out more about that. So Mark. So I don't know if some of you read the article that we had in the paper last week, but waste diversion is a hot topic around here. People are fired up about waste diversion. Recycling, should we recycle, should we not recycle? Food waste, how do we address it? I don't know if you guys are kind of in the loop with food waste, but it's definitely something that there's been a lot of discussion on. We've actually had already 2 Talking Greens about food waste. Specifically, we had Virginia Till with EPA and Brendan McCran from Future Point talking about food waste and addressing food waste. Recently, we know that 40% of food is wasted in the United States, and that's a crazy, crazy number. And ironically, there are 40% of Americans who go without food, and so is it ironic that that number is the same? No, maybe not. What?
Sad.
It is sad, actually. So this is something that a lot of people have been discussing, not only from the point of how can you get people who need food, but what are the environmental impacts of this food waste? The USDA and EPA just came out with a new mandate, 50% food waste reduction by 2030. So we're hearing more and more about it. YDSC is really excited to be engaging with Brendan McCran from Future Point to start looking at what are food waste, who are the food waste stakeholders in town, what are potential solutions to address some of that food waste locally. So we're just starting on that issue locally. But we're really psyched to have Mark here to talk about kind of maybe a little bit broader perspective. Mark is a senior research associate at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory. He works on greenhouse gas inventories and land use, focusing on agriculture and forestry. Mark contributed analysis to multiple IPCC reports on greenhouse gas inventory methods and has worked on national level inventories of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and forestry in States, Brazil, Kenya, Jordan, India, Spain, and Italy. Can you look at pasta? He's currently the technical lead for the Carbon Benefits Project, an initiative funded by the Global Environmental Facility that is building decision support systems for sustainable land use projects to use in evaluating their greenhouse gas balance. Mark has been developing greenhouse gas decision support systems since 1999, and it remains a principal focus in his work. He earned an MS in botany with an emphasis in forest ecology at the University of Vermont in 1991. So let's welcome Mark.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And you've got a lot of really interesting stuff going on here. I was on the website and talking with Sarah and others here in the community, reading the articles in the paper about the dialogue that's going on around waste. And I think that's incredibly important. And my hat's off to you for taking it on. I want to thank my friends Diane and Dave Miller for putting me up, taking me hiking with their goats and fishing today. I also want to give a shout out to Bob and Sarah Woodmansey back here, so down at Stagecoach. Bob is the former director of the organization where I work here, the Natural Resource Ecology Lab. So it's great to see them. And so you might have seen that acronym before, NREL before, and we share it with another organization, the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden. We're different. They're NREL, we're NREL, and we were first. I know this discussion has been, there's been a big discussion here in the community around waste and around recycling, and a lot of really important questions about the greenhouse gas burden associated with recycling. And there have been important questions raised recently about should we recycle? What should we recycle, and how should we recycle it? And so I want to try and contribute to that dialogue today, focusing on food. And it sounds like you've had some people here before talking about food waste. What I'd like to do is try and provide some context where food waste fits into the whole greenhouse gas picture for food, or for bread. And bread is sort of the example that I want to give here, because it's something that's ubiquitous. It's something, even though there are dietary issues for a lot of people associated with bread, we're discovering nowadays, it still remains a staple food for almost half the world's population. And you see it on the plate of so many different meals. And so that's why I chose this topic of bread tonight. So I'm an ecologist, and ecology is really the study of relationships among a lot of different things. It's the study of the relationships between plants and animals, between plants and other plants, between microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and the plants that provide the food for them. But really what that means for me and my work and the research group that I'm at NREL is that we're accountants. We're greenhouse gas accountants. We add up carbon. We add up nitrogen. We try to figure out how much carbon there are in ecosystems, how much nitrogen there is in ecosystems, and the relationship between those things. And Bob and Sarah and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. They contributed to some of the early work on this, starting about 35 years ago.
Keep going.
And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that tonight, but also the role that carbon and nitrogen have in greenhouse gases and agriculture. So I was going to ask the question, who likes bread, but who doesn't like bread?
Bread doesn't like me, actually.
So it's a really important food source. But the story of bread is really the story of wheat when you look at it from a greenhouse gas standpoint. And what I want to do is walk you through the life story of bread. And we're going to be focusing on wheat because that's where most of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with bread as a food come from. It's how we grow wheat and how we process it and prepare it to become bread. So it starts when a farmer tills the soil to prepare a seed bed. And then next, when they plant the seed. After they plant, they'll typically come through and apply fertilizer. Now I want to take a moment here to say I'm describing sort of a general life cycle for wheat. Not every type of wheat in every part of the country is grown this way. But this is sort of a generalization for what we might call conventional wheat. After that, oftentimes they'll apply some type of a pesticide, a fungicide, an herbicide, or something to address an insect problem. When the wheat is ripe, they'll come through with a combine or a harvester and harvest it. And then it gets shipped to a grain elevator or to a miller, where it gets processed into flour. From there, it gets shipped to a baker. And that baker might be just down the street, like Winona's, or it might be one of the giant bakeries that we see. There's a number of them in Denver, surprisingly. Or it might be in Diane's kitchen, or any one of your kitchens here, where you bake bread. But then finally, the story that you guys have been talking about for quite a while now. The story doesn't end in our kitchens and on our tables. It ends in the landfill. And about, as we mentioned, and you all have discussed, about 40% of the food that we produce here in the U.S. ends up in the landfill. And as it turns out, the greenhouse gas story associated with food is as much dependent upon how we deal with the waste as it is how we grow it, how we bake it, and how we eat it. Now I want to, actually, let me back this up here. So you're a pretty informed audience, and I know you all have been discussing climate change and greenhouse gases. So I just want to ask you to think for a second here and look at this life cycle of bread, and think, and just try to imagine where you think the biggest emissions, the biggest greenhouse gases emissions might be. And there's no right or wrong answer here. Anybody want to throw out a guess?
Landfill.
Fertilizer? What was?
I said landfill.
Landfill?
Shipping.
Shipping? Transportation?
Farming.
Farming? Anybody else? Okay. Well, there's more to the story here, and I want to talk about what that is here. So this is just a map of where wheat is grown throughout the country. There's tens of millions of acres where we grow wheat in the U.S., and there's lots of different wheat varieties. But as it turns out, we're also extremely dependent upon natural gas and oil for how we grow our food, as fuel, as a raw material for our fertilizers. And when I first started this work over 15 years ago, and I started to learn about this, I was shocked and I was really frustrated, because I'm a gardener, and it sounds like a lot of you are gardeners too. And it was hard for me to think about, the food that I grew or the food that I got in the grocery store. And it's this pure elemental thing. I didn't want to think about there being a methane story behind it, or there being fossil fuels associated with it. I didn't want to think about nitrous oxide. I just wanted to think about it as food. But as it turns out, there's a legacy of greenhouse gases behind just about every food item that we produce. And it goes straight back to natural gas and petroleum. Now, that said, there's good news. It's not that way everywhere, and there's good progress being made in the way we grow food today that's improving the story a great deal. And so there's great reason to be optimistic about this. So what I want to do now is just briefly introduce you to some of the key greenhouse gases in agriculture, and then we'll go through the life story of wheat and show you where some of those emissions come from, and then show you where the improvements are. So the biggest one is carbon dioxide. It's the common currency. If you think about, like the US dollar is like the common currency of the world that everything gets compared against, all the other currencies get compared against. Carbon dioxide is the common currency of greenhouse gases, and everything gets compared against it. So it has a heat trapping effect of 1. And the main sources in agriculture are burning fossil fuels, plowing the soil, burning forests, pastures, and crops. And there's other sources, but these are the key ones. The next really important gas is nitrous oxide. It has a heat-trapping effect of almost 300, 270 to 300. That means for every pound of nitrous oxide that goes into the atmosphere, it has the same heat-trapping effect as 300 pounds of carbon dioxide. So a little bit goes a long way with nitrous oxide. And the main sources are fertilizers, producing compost in small amounts, and livestock manure. And the last is methane. It has a heat-trapping effect of 34 to 86. So again, a little bit of methane goes a long way. And the main sources are natural gas leaks, landfills, what we call the livestock burps from cattle, from sheep, from other livestock, from growing rice, from livestock manure, and then also small amounts get generated when we produce compost. Now, when we add these all up in the U.S. agricultural inventory for greenhouse gases, it's responsible for somewhere around 8% of the direct emissions the direct greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. inventory. But the legacy effects, there's indirect effects that go all the way through our economy. And so even though only 8% comes through direct emissions from U.S. agriculture, there's probably another several tens of percent more than that, and nobody's actually quite figured it out. But there's a lot more indirect effects in our national greenhouse inventory that come from this. So I just want to walk you through briefly where these emissions come from. So fossil fuels are involved in practically every process of growing wheat and producing bread. And as you all were calling out here, the main sources are from farm operations, from transporting the wheat to market and then transporting bread to your grocer's case or bringing it home. Also from manufacturing fertilizers and from manufacturing of farm implements like tractors and plows. The main source of methane is from landfill waste. It sounds like this is something you all have discussed quite a bit here. The reason methane comes from landfills is when we put food and yard waste or any kind of organic waste, anything that came from plants or from animals into a landfill, mixes with a little bit of water, and then microbes start to eat it. It becomes food for them. But there's very little oxygen in the landfill, and these microbes that have evolved to eat food, to eat these items without oxygen, rather than producing carbon dioxide as a waste product, they produce methane as it. And so it's an extremely important source of greenhouse gases here in the U.S. and abroad. Nitrous oxide comes primarily when we apply fertilizer and afterwards. It's a really important source. And so nitrous oxide, this is the same stuff that a lot of you have probably gotten in the dentist chair. It's exactly the same thing, and it's hard for me to imagine. I've had it a couple of times, and I was surprised to learn afterwards, holy cow, I'm breathing a greenhouse gas here in order to put me under here, to make things a little bit easier. But it's true. Nitrous oxide comes off when fertilizer is applied to soil. You usually get a pulse of nitrous oxide that comes off the soil right after the fertilizer is applied. Not always. It depends on how it's applied and the type of fertilizer. So this is a big generalization, but it's generally the case. But the story doesn't end there. You all might have heard about the big algae blooms in Lake Erie that happen pretty much every year now. And that happens because fertilizer runs off of farm fields where we fertilize wheat and corn and other crops. The fertilizer runs off into the rivers and ends up in the lakes and streams. The same thing with the big dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's caused by fertilizer runoff, mostly nitrogen and phosphorus. But the big issue here is that that nitrogen fertilizer that's trrunning through the streams is food for just trillions of microbes. And every time those microbes utilize some of that nitrogen, almost every time, there's an opportunity to give off a little bit of nitrous oxide. When you add it all up, what we call the direct and the indirect emissions of nitrous oxide is an enormous source of greenhouse gases here in the U.S. It's somewhere between 5 and 10% of our total greenhouse gas inventory here in the U.S. And it's similar in Europe and other developed countries. Especially in China, they probably have the largest emissions because they just use so much fertilizer there. So then finally, the last one is soil carbon. Whenever a farmer plows the soil or does some sort of a disturbance to the soil, it breaks up the clods in the soil, and that essentially enables microbes to get at organic matter that's in the soil. And that comes off, those microbes eat that organic matter, and they give off carbon dioxide. Now this is a really big deal. About a third of what we call the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now that came out since the Industrial Revolution came from the soil, just from farming practices. And to just give you a sense for how big that is, so I told you before that as an ecologist, I'm an accountant, and something that ecologists do is we just add up things. One of the things that Bob and Sarah worked on early on in their career was trying to build a greenhouse gas budget or a carbon budget for the planet. And so adding everything up, what they found, what we've discovered now, is that in the atmosphere there's about 600 billion metric tons of carbon. As it turns out, that's almost the same amount of carbon as there is in trees. Trees and plants and crops, grasslands. Now to compare that against the ocean surface, there's about 1.5 times that amount just in the top 3 feet, the top meter of the ocean surface. But when you look at soils, there's almost 3 times as much carbon as there are in soils. We call soils the excited skin of the planet. And the reason why is because of carbon. And just in this thin layer here, just this top foot, foot to 3 feet, there's just so much carbon there. And my boss, Keith Postion, who heads our research group, says the most important carbon right now is the carbon that's in the ground. We've got to keep it there. And that includes carbon in soils and also carbon in greenhouse gases. So when we add this all up, when we take into account all the different sources of greenhouse gases and the way we grow food, and put it on a balance sheet, there's quite a bit. And so for a single loaf of bread, Dave and I took a couple slices out earlier, so we took this down to a pound. But for this 1 pound of bread right here, this is organics, 22 grain and seed. I bought it at the Safeway here. There's about a legacy of about a pound of greenhouse gases associated with producing this, so that all those upstream emissions. Now, in some cases, it might be a little more. In some cases, it's a little bit less. For conventionally grown bread, that means bread that's grown non-organically, the emissions are actually a little bit higher, and it's largely because of these synthetic fertilizers. If you are buying bread that was produced in a big factory, the emissions from baking are probably a little bit lower because they're so focused on efficiency. So now I want to talk, you've seen the horror story here. So I want to talk about where the good news is. So I want to just describe for you practices that farmers around the country, really around the world, are starting to practice that have good benefits for their bottom line. They're saving money by doing this, and they're reducing greenhouse gases and improving the soil at the same time. So the first is what we call minimum tillage, where farmers are actually practicing no tillage at all, or they're tilling the soil just as little as possible. Now, there's really important soil conservation benefits for this. It's really good for the soil if you don't till it. The downside is that it creates a greater reliance on herbicides in order to be able to do that. So there's a trade-off associated with this, and it's a subject of really lively debate. The next is that biodiesel is becoming more and more available. Biodiesel and other biofuels within in farming communities. And so they can avoid having to use so much conventionally produced diesel fuel that's produced from oil.
Mark, what's your definition of biofuels?
Biofuels? It might be biobutanol, bioethanol, biodiesel, and then there's biogases as well. Another thing that farmers are starting to do now, there's over 10 million acres of cropland in the U.S. last year that were produced with cover crops, where people, in between their crops, they're sowing things like annual rye or vetch or something else in order to keep a plant cover on the soil the whole time, so you don't have bare soil through the winter or through the shoulder season. It turns out that has a huge greenhouse gas benefit to it. You don't have to use as much nitrogen fertilizers. The same thing, more farmers are starting to recognize the need to reinstitute the use of crop rotations. The other news that I'm sure you all are starting to see, alternative energy is becoming more and more part of our electric portfolio. I think not as much as we'd all like to see. I have such a great sense of urgency about this. I'd love to see us convert completely next year. I don't think that's going to happen. But the last thing is that people are starting to recognize, like yourself, the importance of keeping food waste out of landfills. And I was just at a meeting in California this past week where I was working with Cal Recycle and some people with the governor's office around this issue. And the governor of California has just announced that over the next 10 years, they'll be phasing out food waste going into landfills. And they're starting the process now of permitting the composting operations that are necessary in order to deal with that waste and produce the compost that will be going on the croplands and rangelands. So there's progress there. Once again, California is leading the way. But also communities like this. And City of Fort Collins is starting to address this. When we divert food from landfills, we essentially close an important cycle in the food story. If we use that, apply it to croplands, we don't have to apply as much synthetic fertilizer. And when you use it with cover crops and other sort of practices, you may not have to apply any fertilizer at all in order to get the same yield. There's another benefit, which I don't see here, is you're actually storing carbon in the soil. By doing this, you're bringing the carbon back into the soil rather than seeing that carbon go into the atmosphere as methane. So when we do that, if growers, and there are a number of growers that are doing all of these things, when you do that, you can reduce your emissions to a much smaller level. We can reduce our emissions by a factor of 4 or 5. So before, that loaf of bread that had about a pound of emissions might only have a few ounces worth of CO2, or legacy emissions associated with it. And I think that's really good news. For the next slide, this is probably going to bring a lot of groans. Okay? How many of you all heard about the World Health Organization report that just came out about meat? Yeah. And so, and there's so much dialogue going on around this. We're really invested in our food. Diane and I were just talking about this earlier. We think about this so much. You know, we've got family recipes that are just a big part of our lives. And it's hard to think about doing things differently. But this slide, these data were provided or built by the Environmental Working Group, and it shows where bread is. And I'm just going to bring out my pointer here to help with this. I'm sorry that the text here is kind of small, but starting in this area right here, we have, these are foods that what I call are low on the food chain. So we've got rice, nuts, yogurt, broccoli, tofu, dry beans, there's milk, tomatoes, lentils. So these foods have somewhere between 1 and 3 pounds of emissions associated with every pound of food. Here in the middle, we've got eggs, canned tuna, chicken, turkey, somewhere between 5 and 7 pounds of emissions. Here we have farmed salmon, pork, cheese. This is hard cheese, and that's somewhere between 11 and 14 pounds. And then we make a big jump to beef here. This is conventionally grown beef. This is feedlot beef. Actually, there's a lot of controversy about this number right here. It's actually probably quite a bit higher. But as it turns out, working out all the legacy emissions associated with growing feedlot beef is a really complicated thing. And so this is a pretty conservative number right here. It could be as high as 40 pounds. So that's 40 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents for every pound of beef that we eat. And unfortunately, the story for lamb is comparable to that. And when I first saw this, I wanted to cry, okay? Because I call myself a Michael Pollan healthy omnivore. Okay, I eat just across the food spectrum, but about probably 5% of my food calories come from meat or from dairy products. But still, I love those foods. I grew up eating steak, and it's going to be a hard thing for me to give it up. But when I see this, what this tells me is that when I look at this, it impresses upon me that for my own life, I need to make informed food decisions, and I need to just be careful about what I eat. Now, there's good news here for all the gardeners in the room, and for everybody who shops at a local, like at your farmer's market. The green values that you see here are the emissions associated with growing the food. The gold here is associated with processing and distribution. So if you're growing this food yourself in your own garden, you're eliminating all those gold emissions. And if you're buying it at your local farmer's market, you're eliminating a lot of them. Now there's one other slide here, and then I'll sum up. We had the question earlier. Somebody was talking about asparagus that's in the market right now. It was flown in from Peru, and people have asked the question, what's the effect of flying in food? And so this is the thing that really makes me cry, because I love fresh salmon. So this is based on some work that was done by the organization EcoTrust in Portland. And what they found is that when fish is flown in, or when any food is flown in from a long distance, you're amplifying the greenhouse gas emissions by a factor of somewhere between 3 and 5, depending on what the food is. And with fish, it's even higher because you have to keep the fish, there's a very narrow temperature window in order to keep it fresh. So fresh, wild-caught Alaska salmon, that wonderful Copper River sockeye that's coming in, actually has 3 airplane rides before it gets to the fish case in the grocery store. It's literally flown off the beaches in small aircraft. It goes to Anchorage or somewhere in British Columbia. And then from there, it's loaded into larger aircraft, and it's flown to Seattle or Chicago or New York. And then from there, it's loaded onto other aircraft to take it to places like Denver. And then from there, it's trucked to our local. And so that process of flying that food amplifies the greenhouse gas emissions just dramatically. Okay, so what's a concerned consumer to do? So, and this isn't all my work. This is a compilation of what I've been able to glean from some of the work we've done and work of my colleagues. So probably number one, I think, something that we can all do in our local communities, something that we actually have control over, is to try and keep food and yard waste out of landfills. Convert it into a resource that can actually help close the loop, the fertilizer loop and the food loop in our local communities. You can compost or recycle your own organic waste, food, garden waste, yard waste. Use it to fertilize your own garden or give it to your neighbor to use in their garden. You can also eat low on the food chain and support growers who practice good soil conservation, who rotate their crops, use cover crops, fertilized with compost and composted manure. Those are probably growers in your local farmers market. But ask them how they grow their crops and start a conversation with them. And that's how change, one of the ways that change comes about. You can also eat locally produced food that's in season, and then avoid foods that arrive by air. Fresh fish from the coast or winter strawberries. And I've talked with, I should have mentioned this in the previous slide, but I've had dialogue with a number of chefs about this, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet about this where people have examined this. They've looked at fresh fish versus frozen fish. And for salmon, they actually think the frozen fish is better. It's not the case with every fish, but it's fresher. It's frozen within a few hours of after it's caught, and then stays frozen, and it arrives by ship and then by truck to the local market. So I'm going to stop with that, and I want to thank you all very much. It's been great to be here, and I'd love to have a dialogue with you about it. Thank you.
We're going to have a few questions, and then just to be respectful of people's time, we're going to do 15 minutes of questions, and then Mark will be here for a while after, so if you have additional questions, you can hang around and talk to us.
So I noticed on the one slide, milk is relatively low on the food chain, but cheese is way up there, and it's not. It wasn't the yellow portion that made it. It wasn't significant. It was the green portion. But can you talk about that?
You bet. So milk is right in here. And actually, when I talk about low on the food chain, that's probably an exception. I shouldn't refer to that. But milk is shown here at 1.9 pounds per pound of milk, whereas cheese up here is 14 pounds per pound of cheese. And the reason is that milk is largely water. It's about probably, I don't know what percentage water is, but it's somewhere over 80%. And so what you're dealing with here, the legacy of emissions in a pound of milk, when you take the water out of it and turn it into cheese, you're essentially amplifying that by a factor of 4 or 5 what the emissions are associated with that pound of hard cheese. And then there's processing emissions that are associated with that. So does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
So I had a similar question about pork and beef.
Yeah.
What are the factors that make that such a difference? Or chicken?
That's a great question. The main reason is the cow belches. Cows are ruminants, and they, in order to digest their food, they take the grass or whatever they're eating into their first stomach, and then they have a micro community in there that basically converts that into food that they can digest. In the process, they give off lots of methane. There's no oxygen in that first stomach, so they're giving off lots and lots of methane. And so that legacy of emissions here, probably over 3/4 of that is just from what we call enteric methane. And it's the same thing with sheep here, with lamb.
You guys tell that cow you can stick your hand inside of him?
That's kind of cool, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, a little bit. A little gross, too.
No, they've got a bunch of cows at the CSU research farm where they're doing that, where they're actually measuring, they're actually studying the microbe community inside their stomachs to try and figure out, well, why so much methane? And are there ways to actually reduce the amount of methane they give off? That enteric methane story, the cow belches, is one of the most important greenhouse gas stories in the world right now, because so much of the developing world right now, in a lot of places where they can't grow crops because it's arid rangeland, they grow livestock. And there's so many emissions coming off of that, along with the amount of beef and lamb and other meats that we eat in developed countries. So, yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to the controversy of the number and why the range is so large?
Yeah. So the controversy about this number right here, about feedlot beef.
Mm-hmm.
So the main two ways that beef is grown here in the U.S. is either in feedlots, where they're fed. They're typically raised out in places like the Elk River Valley here in the Yampa Valley, up to the point where they're 5 or 6 months old, or some point, and then they go to a feedlot. A lot of the cattle that are raised around here, the calves go down to Greeley, or some of them go to the western slope. And then they're fed a really concentrated diet that includes a lot of grain. And so up here, it's relatively straightforward to look at how cattle are raised and to figure out what these legacy emissions are. But when you take them down to a feedlot where they might be fed 8 or 10 different items over a varying period of time, up to 10 months, figuring out what the legacy emissions from those products is complicated. But basically, so in a single day, they might get corn silage and alfalfa. They might actually get dairy waste, or not dairy waste, but bakery waste. They'll get soybean meal, and they'll get corn. And figuring out what the emissions were associated with producing each of those products, and then the conversion efficiency to meat. And that's where things get complicated, and where some of the controversy is. And what people are starting to say now is that in this number here, they don't think they're accounting for enough of those legacy emissions. So.
I had a question. You were talking about sort of the effects of those microbes in like low oxygen situations, like landfills.
Yeah.
In another composting environment, like an industrial compost,
Yeah.
are you able to increase their use of oxygen? I know they capture methane as well in those situations, and then sort of like in even like a household composting situation, what does that look like?
So your question is really, can you optimize the compost process to reduce or eliminate the greenhouse gases that come from it?
Well, I guess you could CO2 otherwise, but better than methane.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a subject of a lot of research right now, because depending on how you compost, you can produce a lot of greenhouse gases or very little. And yes, you can. The key thing is you have to turn it fairly often. So in these industrial composting operations, there's actually formulas for how often you need to turn it in order to minimize the potential for that. And as far as your garden goes, your own compost pile, I couldn't give you a good recommendation. I wish I could, but you need to turn it fairly often. And depending on how big your pile is, you might want to let your chiropractor know. Get an appointment lined up.
And is that same sort of problem true of like new carbon sources, like defrosting tundra, as well as that largely methane that is produced as microbes go to work on that?
So the question is the thawing permafrost in tundra. That's methane that's coming off of that. Yeah. Sarah?
So organically grown in California versus conventionally grown locally.
Anybody want to weigh in on that? So, if you put it on the balance sheet, there's benefits to both. And so, I want to go back to that one slide.
And maybe to make it simple, just produce. Say just produce, something that's not.
Yeah. So up here, in this whole life cycle right here, organically grown in California, they're doing all of this stuff right here. They're using cover crops, they're using manure or compost as their fertilizer, they're using crop rotations, all of these really good things that are really good for soil and really reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Probably the biggest one is this: they're not using synthetic fertilizers. But they have to till the soil a lot to deal with weeds. They don't have the benefit of being able to apply Roundup. They have to rely on farm implements. And so you get a lot of emissions coming off of the soil here. So there's a trade-off. The good news is there's lots and lots of research, and over, I think 6 different universities now are trying to find a way to grow organically with no tillage, using cover crops and just finding ways to let the cover crops and crop rotations outcompete the weeds. And if they can do that, that's really the gold standard. So if people can do no-till organic, we would be so much further ahead. As far as conventionally grown locally, there's so many benefits to the local food, tying into the local economy. You see what the other greenhouse gas benefits are. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned about certain types of conventional practices. And I think I'd really talk with the grower about it and ask them how they do it. Yeah.
One quick question related to the beef and chicken and turkey and pork. You know, now you see a lot of, even in the grocery stores, but I mean locally here in Steamboat and around the area, grass-fed beef stays out on the farm, you know, doesn't go to a feedlot, I guess until it gets slaughtered, but no antibiotics, no, you know, anything they say. Is that any better or not?
Well, the studies right now that look at that system, grass-finished beef, it indicates it's somewhere up around 40 pounds per pound. But as I said, there's this discussion going on right here about this number right here. This is probably higher, but we don't know how much higher. I think for me, what this says is there's other things to consider here. The health benefits of eating a food like that compared with the food that comes out of from the feedlots. There are real important differences in the characteristics of meat that comes from a feedlot versus grass finished. There's also a lot of reasons to be concerned about in the feedlots that are not managed well, water quality concerns and air quality concerns. So I think in order to make a good decision about this, you need to put everything on a balance sheet and try to get the full picture on it. And so, and it's going to be different for every person based on what their own concerns are. So, yes, sir.
How long will it be before we've taken this graph and we realize that feeding animals instead of us eating the feed is the proper way to go, and then we go to eating insects like a lot of other people? That is a projection that is going to happen.
Anybody want to weigh in on
How much energy does it take to raise enough insects?
That I haven't studied.
It really is head high.
Is there?
What do they say?
That it's ridiculously more efficient to grow insects than to grow for a protein.
Well, let's go to the second stage of not feeding animals and just eating the feed ourselves.
You want to eat hay?
Well, I do now.
I'll speak on it. I'm a rancher, and the thing is about growing things here is we grow grass.
Yeah.
We can't consume grass, and actually, if you look at it globally, cattle are the only thing. Grass grows everywhere except in the Arctic, and the animals adapt to that environment, and they're able to consume that grass and train it into meat. But the other thing that I was looking at as you're weighing in and you're talking about this, when you're looking about these things, are you taking into account the benefits of having cattle?
Exactly.
In the area for carbon sequestration, as a fact, where I was reading about how this place in Texas is all about using the wastewater from their sewer treatment. We did that. We've been doing that for 20 years here in Steamboat Springs on our ranch. So that keeps your sewage that you're flushing. And of course, we love it when we have droughts. As long as the people in town are flushing their toilets, we have water to irrigate our fields, the one field. But it's carbon sequestration. It's taking the grass that grows, and you're looking at the other things, keeping that fire load down. It's stopping desertification, because if you don't keep that grass mowed down, it causes thatch. Thatch keeps light and water and oxygen from getting into the soils, and I can actually take you out to my place and show you the difference across the fence. So you need to take in also account the benefits of the environmental positives of having these animals.
I'm sorry, I just read the graph.
Oh no, but that's true, and I'm interested in the numbers because we want to do do right, and we've been farming in this valley for ranching in this valley for over 100 years. And we have a very productive operation, and we contribute. The other thing that you have to take in sustainability is the economic contribution. And how much of that, 65% of the agricultural economy in the state of Colorado happens to be from cattle.
So please add insects to your graph.
Right. I don't want to give the chocolate. I'm sorry.
So on the 40% of food waste, what percentage of that is post-consumer? What percentage of that is waste from the grocery store? How does that break down, that 40%?
I wish I knew, and I'll bet the two previous looks that you have.
I just read a research study that came out on that, and what it's showing is that 43% of the waste is coming pre-table.
Right.
And so that means those crops that we're being picky about, that, oh, I don't want this peach because it's got a dark spot, or I don't want this tomato because it's not the right shape, or the crops that I get that they may have gotten frozen out, and you still have to, so you have to take them to the landfill. 43% of that, but the rest of it is a lot of it is at the grocery stores.
21% of our landfills are food waste, which is one of the largest percentage of the landfill percentages. Just pretty crazy. Think about a lot of it is post-consumer.
So 43% of that 40 is post-consumer, and so post-consumer is the 57% of the food waste?
That's what it sounds like to me.
And the report I had was that over 43 billion tons are wasted in the United States annually of food.
Which is staggering when 1 in 6 Americans go hungry every day.
Right.
That's right. And with that,
But surely if we stop this silly dating of food, the
Oh, yeah.
dating is just a recommended date when it's added.
I agree.
And people just take that as gospel and say, go throw it out.
But you feed it to my cow.
How much
You feed it to me.
What's the recovery time for if a farmer quits using chemical fertilizer,
Right.
synthetic fertilizer, or whatever? What's the success rate of the soil coming back, actually?
So when you say the recovery time, you mean in terms of
I mean, is it
improving
Mississippi-
the soil quality?
Yeah, as Mississippi River Basin, like if we just stopped spraying it,
Yeah.
would it just be dead?
So there's a couple different issues here. So there's a lot of different ways that you could look at soil recovery, but the data that I've seen indicate that it takes about, from the point where a farmer switches to no-till, for example, and stops plowing the soil, it takes about 5 to 6 years for the soil to consolidate to the point where there's actually clods in there, where if you pulled up a shovelful, you'd actually pull up one big clod of soil there. So 5 to 6 years for that. And that's a really important process right there. So that has all kinds of benefits for the soil will start holding more water. You won't have so much runoff, so much water runoff. Lots of other benefits with that. As far as the fertilizer goes, there's so many things that come into play with that. There's a big focus right now because of the economic effects of that dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico and in Lake Erie and other places. That costs, it's billions of dollars a year in opportunity costs. The way it affects the fishery in the Gulf of Mexico and the way it's affecting the ecosystem and water quality issues in the Great Lakes states. It's costing other people billions of dollars. And so there's a lot of emphasis on that right now. And unfortunately, it's a really complicated problem because the decision to make how to fertilize, what to fertilize with, when to fertilize, those decisions are made one field at a time throughout the whole watershed. And trying to understand what the issues are and then communicate that well to the growers, who I think the majority of which want to do the right thing. They just don't have access to the right resources, or the products aren't available for them, or they don't have the expertise for it. So trying to understand what the solutions are, and then through extension get the word out, or through the fertilizer manufacturers, that it's a really complicated problem. So.
Mark, there's another issue with that too, and that's the economics of changing your whole operation over.
Yeah, it is.
And
It's a big
it's
deal.
very expensive to change without having this actual background and knowing that 5 years down the line, that piece of equipment that you just invested $100,000 in is either going to be doing what you need it to do.
That's a real barrier for a lot of people.
Especially because you have to fight the lobbyists of the current food industry.
Or you've got a risk. You've got some kind of a financial risk. You may not have the capital or the money in the bank to be able to get you through a down year if the change that you're making doesn't turn out as planned. Mm-hmm. And so that's something where a lot of growers are exposed to that kind of risk.
And even in hay production, when we've never used chemical fertilizers on our hay, but our neighbors have, and then they decided not to, and it took them. But we had a slight drought here. It took them 5 years to get their production by just using their cow manure to get that production of hay back up to where it was before they stopped.
Yeah.
And that's a financial cost that you have to factor in.
There was a question here, and then Bob.
Yeah, I wonder why, since in one of the earlier slides you pointed out that actually nitrous oxide is bigger pollutant by far, by scale of about 3. Why so much focus on methane when actually the bigger problem is nitrous oxide?
Okay, that's a great question.
Per pound.
Per pound, yeah. I mean, it's 3 times more.
That's the answer right there. So when we put this on a balance sheet, even though nitrous oxide is such a powerful gas, there's much smaller amounts of it that come off. But a little bit goes a long way with it. And so when you add it all up, fertilizer, nitrous oxide, and manufacturing fertilizer is about 1/3 of the total emissions. And then about another third is associated with how we throw away the food. And then the baking process is about another third. Slightly less than that, because there's other emissions associated with transport and manufacturing equipment, and then the soil carbon issue there.
But that's a CO2 slide, not nitrous oxide, right?
This is the whole thing. This is everything
okay.
converted into that common currency of CO2.
Oh, okay.
Bob, you had it.
Yeah, the accounting system this is kind of data that we haven't had for very long. We've been working on it less than 15 years, and now it's becoming a good, solid data set.
Yeah.
I think what we have, and it relates to ranching just like with the farming, it's more of a social problem than it is an accounting problem. We have, if everybody operated their ranch the way you probably do, that would be wonderful. Not everybody does that.
It's in anything. There's always bad actors.
In farming, not everybody is going to go to the no-till processes. It's happening, but it's only 20%, 25%.
That's right.
In the Great Plains. And so it's a matter of engaging people first to get that thought that I don't have to do it the way Daddy did it. Or, a lot of ranchers, we've been here 100 years, and by God, I'm going to keep doing it the way I learned. And we know better than that now.
But we also have the issue of people saying throw out the old completely, and you can't do that because each ranch, each place is unique unto itself. It has its own little,
Well,
when I do government programs, and if I sign up for them, and there's some of the things they want me to do, they're not going to work in my conditions, at my elevation, and and it's an all one way or all the other, but you have to look at that particular piece of land and what's working on it.
surely, but there are principles.
Oh, yeah, there are
And,
principles, but what I do on my
Mark
north
and I are
slopes
both
is a lot
ecologists,
different than what I do on my
and
south
there are
slopes.
ecological principles
Yeah.
that can be applied to ranching or cultivated agriculture, and hopefully we'll get away from that. But it's still a matter of how do you engage the people doing the work to convince them that it's in their own best interest to change, or if they're altruistic, then at least do it for some greater cause. And that, I think, is one of the big areas that we just really don't know how to grasp.
If we want
want to eat local, there's a great way to do it, and that's to go onto the Community Agricultural Alliance website, and we have over 40 producers, local producers, everything from eggs to meats to seasonable vegetables to honeys to all those kind of things. And you can support those local producers and you can eat well. So check it out if you're interested. And that's my advertising.
Thanks, Mark, be around, still a little longer if you guys want to talk to him. We also have recorded this, so this will be up on our website. If you would like more information about our programming or to get a link to this, we do have a sign-up sheet at the back if you're not already on our discount newsletter. So thanks you guys for coming.
Thank you.